Hello, everyone. This is Philippa Benson, the managing editor of CABI Agriculture and Bioscience, CABI's open access, multidisciplinary journal covering all research in agriculture and related biosciences. Today, our webinar is focused on preparing to submit your manuscript to a specific journal and the many issues involved. Most all senior scientists have learned from experience how important it is to have all the materials at hand, double and triple check before you begin the process of submitting to a specific journal. Lots of problems can arise if you don't have all the materials prepared and in proper order. In this webinar, I'll present lots of reminders of what you need to have checked and prepared before you submit. And if you do these things, you'll have a better chance of getting your manuscript into review and eventually published. One first critical step and a good rule of thumb is to remember that every journal is different and each and every journal has its own specific expectations and rules for submission. Although there are many, many commonalities, there are a lot of small differences from journal to journal. So you need to read the instructions to authors very carefully before you begin. And remember that each journal is different. And if you're going to submit a manuscript that perhaps has been rejected from one journal, you need to do the whole process over again and look carefully at the requirements of the next journal you're submitting to. So, another important point to remember is that you should take a step back as you begin this process to consider all the different audiences that come into play through the research and publication process that will be impacted by the decision you make about where and when to submit. Researchers at the beginning of their careers may start to think about a subset of these audiences when they're finalizing the materials to submit. But all these different players that I'm going to go through are involved throughout the research process, and you should keep them in mind all throughout this because they will come into play when you're actually submitting the publication. So, of course, you need to think about your co-authors and your colleagues when you're preparing that final manuscript and all the materials. But you'll also need to think about the institution that you're in. Those institutions need to be considered when you submit and how fast you can get a particular manuscript published, because it might come into play when someone is trying to get a promotion or tenure within a specific institution, and the requirements of those institutions may impact the journal or other materials that you need to have at hand when you submit. In addition, funders also have requirements that need to be considered. Specifically for their grant recipients. They may require that the work be submitted to an open access journal, or that authors play certain roles on the manuscript. Funders also look at the publication or productivity of a researcher when they're deciding about awarding grants or other funding. Along with funders, publishers also have an increasing number of requirements for manuscripts when they're being submitted. Things like ORCID IDs, these are the persistent identifiers for individual authors, and they may have requirements also for data sharing or other specifics of that kind. You need to have all of those in mind when you are preparing those final materials. Of course, you have to think about the editors and the publication staff. They're critical players throughout the submission process and when you're revising, when your manuscript is getting reviewed, when it's getting published, and also when you're promoting the outcomes after publication. So all these people are involved in making decisions about your manuscript and keeping it moving through the publication process without glitches. So I just want to encourage you to think about this point in time when you're getting ready for submission, and you should have all these different players in mind throughout the entire publication process, because when you get to that point of submission, they'll all be involved one way or another. So, preparing for submission, what's a good thing to do? You're getting ready for takeoff. When you're getting ready to actually submit, you should have checklists in mind, and we're going to be providing those for you. This will make for an easy takeoff and a smooth landing through the process of getting your manuscript evaluated, reviewed, and through to actual publication. Some journals have actually prepared their own checklists. So you should look on the journal's website to see if any of those are available. Also, you can look on AgriArchive, the CABI preprint server, and our educational resources there, and that's where you'll find additional checklists of all different kinds. So a good first step is to get some checklists and to go through them carefully, step by step. Don't jump over any steps. They are critical. They may seem small at one point, but actually they can prevent problems down the line. So why should you bother to check everything every time? Well, if you make a mistake, it really makes a bad impression on the editors and the staff at the journal. Small things like not having your paperwork in, or missing a critical figure file or something of that kind, it just makes a bad impression. And errors and omissions slow down the evaluation and publication process through review and publication. So that, again, is not good for you, and it's not for the journal, good for the journal. In addition, mistakes are difficult to correct after submission, and they can lead to persistent errors in the manuscript and consistent slowdowns. So mistakes that you make at this point in the process can waste an editor's time throughout many different stages and can become highly problematic later down the line. So go through these checklists carefully. It really is that important. All right, so let's get into it. What are some of the basic checks you need to do of your manuscript? First of all, you got to make sure that the topic really fits the journal that you're submitting to. Usually you've done that, but just double check, look at the scope and aim statement of the journal. Go through your manuscript and make sure that you have correct and consistent spelling. Basic language, as well as names and terms and acronyms. Common mistakes that editors and journal staff see all the time are problems with genus species names, inconsistency or misspellings in authors' names, the names of certain kinds of tests or equipment or chemicals or drugs, and also place names. You need to make sure that the acronyms are spelled out correctly on the first use, and that they're used correctly throughout the manuscript, and the same with numbers, and that you're following the specific journal guidelines. So it's not just the first use, but you need to check throughout the manuscript to make sure that the spelling is correct and consistent throughout the manuscript. So you also should check the manuscript for grammar, readability, style and plain language. So you should write in short, clear sentences. You should use the active voice. In general, broad, multidisciplinary journals, you should avoid too many specialist words, and if you do need to use them, make sure you have an explanation. And in specialized journals, you probably don't need to have these long explanations, so don't overdo it if you know that your manuscript or your paper is generally going to be read by people who already have some level of expert knowledge in the topic. But again, read through it carefully. Short, simple sentences. You don't need to write in convoluted language, and use the active voice. Most journals now, which differs from several decades ago, where passive voice was preferred, most journals now explicitly state that they prefer manuscripts be written in the active voice. So, in addition, make sure that your manuscript is within the stated word limits for that particular journal, and also that your number of references and figures and tables are all within the stated limits of that journal. Make sure also that you have sufficient funds to pay for any fees, open access fees, pay other page charges, color charges. Make sure that you know what your funding status is, because you may be asked about those things either at submission or later on in the process. Very, very important. Make sure that any IDs, persistent IDs that are required, these are researcher IDs like author IDs, funder IDs, institutional IDs, data IDs, data deposition IDs. Look at the requirements of the journal that you're submitting to and make sure that you have them at hand when you actually go to submit the manuscript. You should try to put your data into an open repository, and you must do it when it's required by the journal. So look carefully at the instructions to authors and make sure that your data is in a repository if it's required, and that you have the correct ID numbers for that. If you are a non-native speaker of English, and you have a colleague that is a native speaker of English, it's always a good idea to have them read over it, just for some basic things that can be tricky, like use of articles and things of that sort. And if a journal requires that you put manuscript line numbers on your manuscript, make sure that your actual file has those line numbers on them when you're going to submit. So again, many of these things go back to reading the instructions for authors carefully and doing a first round of thorough basic checks. So next, you need to think about author information. You need to make sure that all the co-authors have seen and approved of the final version of the paper. Lots of problems can come up if the version that you submit has some aspect, some language, some data of some sort that one of the authors isn't happy with. As someone who has led a number of different journals, I've seen huge problems come up with this kind of author disagreement, because a version of a paper that wasn't final and wasn't approved by all the authors ended up being submitted. Many journals now require that you verify that all co-authors have seen and approved the final submitted paper, and it's also not a bad statement to make in your cover letter. Make sure that the author list and all the related information, authors, institutional affiliations, and the order of authorship is complete and correct. In addition, make sure that the contact details and the institutional affiliations are correct, again, in particular for the first and corresponding authors. That's really, really important. Make sure that other forms for each author are also complete and correct. So this may be a license to publish form. This may be other disclosure forms. These may be copyright related forms. Make sure that you have all of those required by the journal at hand and ready to upload when you're getting ready to actually submit your manuscript. Also make sure that all the information that the entire author group has agreed upon in terms of putting items in the acknowledgement section are complete and correct, and again, agreed upon by the entire author group. This can also make for smoother sailing, that you don't omit anybody from that group, and that you don't include people who shouldn't be there. So make sure that you have those items. Again, as I mentioned before, and I want to say again, make sure that all your data is complete and accessible and available to be seen by reviewers if the reviewers request to see that. You should really make sure of that, so when a request like that comes in, you don't have to stumble around and go and retrieve it and put it somewhere. That will just hang up the review process. So when you are getting ready to submit, make sure that your data is somewhere that other people can get it. Make sure that you're able to share materials used in your study if this is required by the journal and requested by reviewers or readers or perhaps editors. So again, read the instructions to authors really, really carefully and make sure that the materials you used are that you can get them to people easily. And in particular, also make sure that any consent or review forms for verification of institutional or other review boards are available, and that you have those at hand when you're ready to actually begin the submission process. Another thing that you need to check, I told you, these are really long lists, but they're important to do. Make sure that the number of citations that you have in your text are within the limits of the journal you're submitting to. Every journal is different. So even if the manuscript is pretty much the same, you may need to make some changes to the number of citations, and that means going back in and changing the text a little bit if you are wildly over the limits for the journal that you're submitting to. So just check to make sure that the straight number of citations is within the guidelines of a particular journal. You should make sure that all the references cited in the text are included in the end reference list, and that they're formatted according to the journal guidelines, and that they are properly spelled and have all the correct dates. If there are problems like that, they can hang things up at the end and end up wasting a lot of time for everybody involved. So make sure that not just that all the text, all the references in the text are in the reference list, but that all the references in the end reference list are in the text. Some authors sometimes forget to take out from the reference list citations that they may have had in the manuscript in an earlier version. So just make sure there's a one-to-one correlation. Everything in the text is in the reference list, and everything in the reference list is in the text. Make sure that all the details in every citation are correct. And if you have any links that are linked to the internet, that make sure that at the time of submission that you've checked that those links are active and accurate. And in the citation list, you should have a viewed date to verify that you checked that specifically at a specific time. And also, whenever possible, check that the digital object identifiers, those persistent identifiers for publications, if the journal requires you to have DOIs for everything on your reference list, make sure that they are complete and correct. And you can test those. You can put a DOI into the verification function at Crossref. Here's the URL, www.crossref.org, and you can check to make sure that your DOI links to the correct citation at that point. All right, going on. You also need to check your figures and tables separately. Make sure that they're aligned to the requirements of the journal. Make sure that all the figures, tables, graphics that you submit are mentioned in the text, and that they're the final author-approved versions, and that they're labeled in the correct author order as mentioned in the text, and this includes in the captions. You should check carefully to make sure that the figures and tables adhere to the journal instructions in terms of font and type size and design and color, and also that your equations are formatted correctly if you have any mathematical equations of any kind. So these are things in particular that are easy for you to check and change and get right the first time when you're submitting. These details, if they're all aligned with journal requirements, will help you and your manuscript make a really good first impression on the editors and the reviewers. If you have them wrong, it can get really frustrating. Do make sure that the files are in the size limits allowed by the journal or preferred by the journal. So that's another thing. Now, some of these are not quite as important at your initial submission, but they're definitely critically important if you're revising your manuscript and you're submitting your revised materials. When a manuscript gets to the point that it has been sent out to revision with comments by reviewers and you need to adjust your manuscript and materials in response to those, and you're resubmitting your manuscript, that is when it's really critically important to have these details with your figures and tables and everything else aligned. But in particular, figures and tables, which can take a little bit of time and effort to get formatted according to specific journal guidelines. So, and also, of course, make sure that they are in the file formats, not just the sizes, but the file formats required by the journal. So, many research submissions these days have a lot of supplementary material. So you need to look very carefully at the journal requirements for supplementary materials and make sure that what you submit, if you do have supplementary materials, are aligned with the journal requirements, that they're complete and ordered in the same order that they're referenced in the main manuscript, that video or similar files are in the correct format and that they function properly, that the files are in the specified limits. These are the same things as the primary manuscript, but you need to make sure that those materials that you upload as supplementary materials are equally aligned with the journal requirements. So that's, complete, correct size limits, file formats. Similarly, with photos and graphics, you need to make sure that they're in the resolution required by the journal, that all the necessary permissions from any copyright holders are in hand, complete and correct if you're borrowing materials that have been previously published, and that all the photos and graphics are in the correct sizes and have the journal's preferred fonts and font sizes and types of that kind. Now, lastly, getting to the cover letter. You should have that cover letter written and at hand when you're getting ready to submit. It should be about a page, 4 to 5 different paragraphs with different specific components. If you go to the CABI author education portal, you'll see a separate and detailed webinar on how to write an effective cover letter. And it goes over these specifics in a little more detail. The first paragraph should have basic information, the article title, the authors, the correct journal name, and the type of submission. Is it a research article, a review, something else? That cover letter should include a very concise explanation of the content of the article, the core findings, explicitly what is new about those findings, why those findings are important, why it's a good fit for the journal, and why the journal should accept that new manuscript now. The timing, is the timing correct? Cover letters should also explicitly state any conflicts of interest that authors may have and include other useful information. For example, if the submission is an invited resubmission, if it was transferred from another journal, if there are issues with data, if an earlier version had been posted on a preprint server, or if a related manuscript is perhaps under consideration at another journal. Of course, this would be a related manuscript, not the same manuscript. You should never have the same manuscript under consideration at 2 journals at the same time. That is a huge no-no. That is highly unethical. But you may, for example, be submitting a primary research article to one journal and then have a detailed methodology paper that is not in that primary journal's scope. And you may have a methodology paper that you've submitted to a journal that focuses on methods. And cover letters should also include names of suggested and excluded reviewers. So that's a big, long list of things to check, but I assure you that if you go through these steps, they will prevent glitches and hitches in the review process and help you get your manuscript moving forward and hopefully through to publication most smoothly if you've checked on all these details. So you do need to remember that you have to do these checks every time. So at the initial submission, you should make sure that you have these things checked. If you get through to revision and you have to upload and send in a revised manuscript, you need to check things very, very, very carefully at that stage as well. Don't assume just because you did it at the first submission. Lots of things change with revised manuscripts. You may change figures or tables. You may change citations. Lots of things can change. You have to go through that process again, step by step, item by item. And again, that final submission, you may go through several rounds of reviews. There may be details that you need to check. So again, you need to go through this entire list again and check the manuscript carefully. So some of the things may, if you've checked them in the first round, you may not need to check again in the final round. For example, that your data is in an open repository, or that all the author licenses or permission forms are in place. Once you get those in and locked, as long as the author list hasn't changed, then you probably don't need to check those things again. But you do need to check all those other items. So go through them carefully each time you upload a new version of your manuscript. So make sure, again, at the beginning of the process that you have some of these detailed requirements, all the author forms that you need, all the persistent identifiers, digital object identifiers for things in your reference list, if required by the journal, the ORCID IDs or persistent researcher identifiers, the IDs of the funding agencies that have supported the work, perhaps for IDs for your institutional affiliations as well. Check to see if the journal you're submitting to requires these things, and make sure you have them at hand when you're about to upload and submit your paper. Make sure also that you've looked at requirements for data deposition and data sharing, and that your submission adheres to the guidance of the particular journal you're submitting to, and that you have any copyrights, licenses, permissions that are required by the journal. And do make sure that your figures, photographs, tables are in the right size and right resolution. Have those triple checked before you get into the actual submission process, where you hit that submit your manuscript button. So a critical step, again, as I am closing out this, is to remind you again that every journal is different. Although many of the parameters for submission are similar, there are fine points that 100% are different from journal to journal. So every journal is different. Look at the instructions to authors and read them carefully. So that's from stem to stern, the things you need to be thinking about when you're getting ready to actually submit your manuscript. Now, we hope, of course, that you will consider submitting your manuscript to CABI Agriculture and Bioscience. Before we close today's presentation, I want to encourage you to visit CABI.org for information, publications, and education related to agriculture and biosciences. Specifically, I hope that you will visit CABI Agriculture and Bioscience, CABI's open access multidisciplinary journal. The journal is published in collaboration with BMC, Springer Nature's open access branch, and is led by an editorial board of top-ranking researchers from around the world. The journal is compliant with best practices in publishing for high-impact journals and is committed to publishing rigorously conducted science. We accept both primary and cross-disciplinary studies and those with broad global impacts, as well as studies that reflect more narrow, specific, and local applications. We are committed to thorough, fast, and fair peer review. And again, we're open access with links on both the BMC and CABI websites. I also encourage you to visit AgriArchive, CABI's preprint server. This is a free open access resource for unpublished preprint materials across all the agriculture and biosciences. It's hosted and managed by CABI, and there's no fee for submitting. Materials are posted within 72 hours after a quick review for appropriateness of topic, but the materials are not peer-reviewed, edited, or typeset in any way before being posted online. You'll also find CABI's author education and services portal on the AgriArchive website. Thank you all for listening to this webinar, and if you have any questions or comments, please send them to me at p.benson@cabi.org. Thanks very much. Bye.